Hey there and welcome back. Today we're going to talk as briefly as we can about the rack pull. What a rack pull is, how you perform a rack pull, and why you might want to incorporate the rack pull into your training. The rack pull is an assistance lift for the deadlift. It's also a fairly major pulling movement in its own right. It's a deadlift that's performed with partial range of motion. So you're setting up the lift inside a power rack and you're pulling the bar from the pins. You can pull it from a multitude of heights. A very common height is right below the knee. So that's what a rack pull is. How to perform the rack pull. You're going to perform your 5-step setup just like you do in the deadlift, and we'll link to a video below that talks about that, but the steps are the same. You're going to take your stance with the bar over the middle of your foot. You're going to take your grip. You're going to bring your shins to the bar. You're going to squeeze your chest up, and you're going to pull, remembering that when you're pulling, you're really thinking push the floor away with your legs. Now, a note on taking your stance, because this is probably the easiest thing to mess up when doing the rack pull. When you're setting up on the floor, we often recommend that people look over the side of their shoe to check and see if the bar is 1 inch away from their shins. In other words, to make sure that the bar is over the middle of the foot. This is especially true in the rack pull, because in a rack pull, what a rack pull is, when you think about the bar being just below the level of your knees, for instance, we'll use that height as kind of a sample height here for the rack pull. When you think about a deadlift, when it gets to that point just below your knees, your shins have changed their angle. They start off at a slightly forward angle, and by the time that bar gets to that point just below your knees, your shins are very nearly vertical, which means that if you set up correctly on a rack pull, it's going to feel like you're crowding the bar because your shins won't get to move very far forward at all. On that step 3, when you bring your shins to the bar, when you bend your knees to bring your shins to the bar, they will not go very far because, again, you can think of a rack pull as a deadlift that has already been partially completed for you. So make sure that you're setting up with the bar over the middle of the foot. A good way to do that is to look over the side when you're getting set up. Why would you use a rack pull? A rack pull can be used for a number of purposes. Number one, and this is not really in a particular order, it can be used in a rehab context. So perhaps someone doesn't have the ability to pull from the floor, whether it's due to an injury, in which case this would be a rehab context, or perhaps they're not strong enough or their balance is not such yet that they can pull from the floor. They can sometimes pull from a higher position. So maybe you start them off around the height of the knees, and then over time you work them lower. Now they're pulling, below the knee. Now they're 1 inch below the knee. Now they're 2 inches below the knee, until eventually they're pulling from the floor again. So that's one way to use a rack pull, where you're trying to add range of motion slowly over time in the eventual goal of getting back to pulling from the floor. Another reason you might want to use a rack pull is if someone has a tough time setting their back, getting their back in that nice, flat, rigid extension that we're looking for. When the bar is higher up, as it is in a rack pull, it is often easier to set the back. So you can squeeze your chest up, you can get your back flatter, and then you can take this new skill that you've learned of setting your back, and now you can take the same approach. Now you can try to go 1 inch lower, 2 inches lower, 3 inches lower, still making sure that you're setting your back rigidly every step along the way until, hopefully, several workouts later, maybe even just one workout later, you are now setting your back correctly while you're pulling from the floor. And last, another reason to use the rack pull is to support progress on the deadlift. This is often used in conjunction with the halting deadlift. We'll do a separate video on that, where 1 week you might pull a heavy set of 5 on your rack pull, and the next week you might do a heavy set of the halting deadlift. You can pull a rack pull at very heavy weights. You can probably perform a set of 5 somewhere around the weight. If you're pulling from below the knee, you can probably pull a heavy set of 5 somewhere around the same weight that you could pull for a 1 rep max on the deadlift. So you're training a partial range of motion, and that's why you can pull a very heavy weight. But used in this context, the rack pull is a great tool for intermediate and advanced level lifters to support their progress on the deadlift. One important thing to note about a rack pull will bend your bar over time. So you want to use a crappy bar, because if it isn't crappy to begin with, it will be eventually. When you set down the rack pull, when you set down a normal deadlift, let's start with that. When you set down a normal deadlift, the plates, when it's sitting on the ground, support the bar. When you set down a rack pull, it is the opposite. That bar is sitting on the pins, and that bar is supporting the plates, which are just hanging there, which means every time you set it down, that is a significant shock to the barbell. You'll notice it in the whip of a heavy rack pull when you set it down. You will not be able to avoid this. You don't want to set down your 400, your 500 pound rack pull, you know, at glacially slow speeds. So use a crappy barbell. This is important so that you don't destroy your very nice bar that you want to use for all your other lifts. We hope this was useful, and if it was, please let us know. Hit the subscribe button or leave us a comment below or give us a thumbs up. We will see you next time, and as always, we hope this helps you get stronger and live better.